For decades, two enormous towers dominated the New York skyline. They were more than just office buildings, they became symbols of American ambition, engineering, and global business. But behind their massive steel frames was a remarkable story of how they were designed, built, and brought to life. How could engineers create buildings this tall in the heart of Manhattan? And why did the Twin Towers become so important to the world? Let's go back to the beginning. Subscribe for more documentaries. In the early 1960s, New York leaders wanted to strengthen Lower Manhattan as a major center of international trade. The plan called for a massive new complex that could bring businesses, offices, transportation, and commerce together in one location. At its heart would stand two exceptionally tall towers. The idea was ambitious for its time, but turning that vision into reality would require engineering on an extraordinary scale. The proposed World Trade Center would not simply add two skyscrapers to New York. It was designed as an enormous commercial complex, with offices, public spaces, transportation connections, and underground infrastructure. The project would transform a large section of Lower Manhattan. But before the towers could rise into the skyline, engineers first had to solve a much more difficult problem: how to create a deep and stable foundation in one of the busiest parts of New York. Before the towers could rise, engineers had to go deep beneath the streets. The World Trade Center site was close to the Hudson River, where groundwater made a massive excavation especially challenging. Engineers developed a deep underground retaining system that allowed construction to continue while protecting the surrounding city. This enormous excavation would eventually become part of the foundation supporting the future towers and underground complex. Once the deep excavation was prepared, construction could move to the structural foundation. Massive steel and concrete elements were placed below ground to create a stable base for the enormous towers. The foundation had to transfer the weight of the future building safely into the ground while resisting pressure from the surrounding soil and water. Long before the towers became visible above Manhattan, a huge hidden structure was already taking shape beneath the city. With the foundation taking shape below ground, the construction finally began to rise above Manhattan. Massive steel columns were lifted into position by towering cranes, creating the first visible outlines of the future skyscrapers. Each section had to be precisely aligned before the next one could be installed. Slowly, layer by layer, the enormous structures began climbing toward the New York skyline. As the steel framework climbed higher, another challenge became increasingly important: wind. At great heights, even moderate winds can cause a tall building to sway. Engineers therefore had to design the towers so they could remain strong while also allowing controlled movement. The solution would become one of the defining features of the Twin Towers, a structural system designed around their steel frames and the way those frames interacted with the building's outer walls. The Twin Towers were designed to look simple from a distance, but their structure was anything but simple. Instead of relying on a traditional arrangement of interior columns, engineers placed much of the structural strength around the building's perimeter and within a strong central core. This allowed large areas of open office space inside. The result was a distinctive exterior appearance, and an innovative approach to building extremely tall. As construction continued, the towers grew beyond almost everything around them. Each tower would eventually contain 110 floors, making them among the tallest buildings in the world. From the ground, the upper sections seemed to disappear into the sky. But reaching that height required thousands of structural components to be positioned with extraordinary precision. The higher the towers climbed, the more impressive, and more demanding, the construction became. Once the towers were completed, the Twin Towers became more than giant structures on the skyline. Inside, thousands of offices filled their enormous floors, creating a vertical workplace unlike almost anywhere else. Businesses, employees, visitors, and daily services all operated within the complex. Every morning, people entered through the massive lobby, then moved upward through one of the most sophisticated elevator systems ever installed in a skyscraper. Moving thousands of people through buildings this tall required an extraordinary elevator system. The Twin Towers used multiple elevator zones, including express elevators that could travel quickly between major levels. Passengers could then transfer to local elevators serving specific floors. This system reduced the amount of space needed for elevator shafts while allowing people to move efficiently through more than 100 stories. The towers were designed to accommodate an enormous amount of office space. Their wide, open floors gave companies flexibility to arrange desks, meeting areas, and workspaces in different ways. Large windows brought daylight into the offices while the central core contained important services and vertical transportation. From the outside, the towers looked almost identical. Inside, however, thousands of separate workplaces were operating every day. For visitors, one of the most spectacular experiences was reaching the observation decks near the top of the towers. From hundreds of meters above Manhattan, the city appeared completely different. Streets looked tiny, bridges stretched across the surrounding rivers, and the skyline seemed to continue in every direction. On clear days, visitors could see far beyond Lower Manhattan, turning the Twin Towers into one of New York's most famous viewpoints. The Twin Towers were only the most visible part of a much larger complex. Beneath and around them was a network of retail areas, transportation connections, underground spaces, and public walkways. The World Trade Center was designed to function like a small city within the city. Thousands of people could work, shop, travel, and move through the complex without ever needing to leave the surrounding area. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the World Trade Center had become a major part of daily life in Lower Manhattan. Office workers arrived each morning, visitors moved through the plazas, and businesses operated across the enormous complex. From street level, the Twin Towers towered above everything around them. Yet most of the activity happened inside, quietly, continuously, and thousands of feet below the attention of the skyline. Behind the tower's striking appearance was an engineering system designed to handle enormous forces. The closely spaced exterior columns worked together with the central core, creating a strong structural framework around the building. Floors connected these major components into one system. This approach helped make the towers both tall and relatively efficient, while giving architects the large open office areas that had been planned from the beginning. Every day, thousands of people moved through the Twin Towers without thinking about the enormous engineering surrounding them. Elevators carried passengers upward, offices filled the floors, and mechanical systems quietly kept the buildings operating. From the outside, the towers appeared almost motionless against the sky. Inside, however, they were constantly active, an enormous vertical network of workplaces, transportation, communication, and daily human activity. By the 1980s and 1990s, the Twin Towers had become one of the defining features of New York's skyline. Their enormous height made them visible from many parts of the city and even from across the surrounding waterways. They became a familiar landmark for commuters, visitors, and people arriving in New York. For millions, simply seeing the two towers meant one thing: the unmistakable skyline of Manhattan. After sunset, the Twin Towers took on a completely different appearance. Thousands of illuminated windows formed two enormous vertical patterns above the city. Around them, Manhattan continued moving through the night, traffic filled the streets while the towers remained visible above the surrounding skyline. Their lights became a familiar part of New York's nighttime identity, making the buildings recognizable even after darkness covered the city. By the 1990s, the Twin Towers were no longer simply a landmark of New York. Their distinctive shape appeared in photographs, films, television programs, travel guides, and news reports around the world. Visitors recognized the towers before they even reached Lower Manhattan. They had become part of the visual identity of the city itself, a symbol instantly associated with New York and its place on the global stage. At the beginning of the new millennium, the Twin Towers remained a busy part of New York's financial district. Thousands of people worked inside the complex every day, while visitors continued to arrive from around the world. The towers had already survived decades of changing technology, business, and city life. Their familiar presence had become so normal that few people could imagine Manhattan without them. On the morning of September 11, 2001, New York began the day like any other. People traveled to work, offices opened, and the Twin Towers stood above Lower Manhattan as they had for decades. But within a short time, the ordinary morning would become one of the most consequential days in modern history. The events that followed would permanently change New York, the United States, and the world. As the attacks unfolded, the normal rhythm of New York suddenly disappeared. Emergency services began responding across Lower Manhattan, while people outside the area tried to understand what was happening. The scale of the event quickly became clear, and the Twin Towers became the center of an unprecedented emergency. For the people of New York, an ordinary workday had turned into a moment of confusion, fear, and profound uncertainty. As the emergency grew, firefighters, police officers, medical teams, and other responders moved toward Lower Manhattan. Their goal was to help people leave the affected buildings and bring order to a rapidly changing situation. Communication became critical as different emergency teams coordinated their response. Across the city, roads and transportation networks were disrupted, while people searched for information about what was happening. As the emergency response continued, evacuation became a critical priority. People were directed away from the affected area while emergency crews worked under extremely difficult conditions. Across Lower Manhattan, streets became crowded with responders and evacuees moving in different directions. The operation required constant coordination, communication, and courage. In the middle of the chaos, countless people focused on one goal: helping others reach safety. After the towers were gone, Lower Manhattan faced an enormous recovery effort. Streets around the World Trade Center site were filled with emergency crews, engineers, investigators, and heavy equipment. The focus gradually shifted from immediate rescue operations toward clearing the site and understanding what had happened. The familiar skyline had changed forever, leaving New York with the difficult task of rebuilding both the physical site and a sense of normal life. As the recovery effort continued, attention also turned toward preserving the memory of those who were lost. Families, survivors, first responders, and communities across the country began remembering September 11th in deeply personal ways. Over time, the former World Trade Center site became a place of remembrance. The challenge was no longer only rebuilding a part of Manhattan, but creating a space where history could be remembered with dignity. Rebuilding Lower Manhattan became one of the most ambitious urban projects in modern New York. New buildings, transportation systems, public spaces, and a new memorial were planned around the historic site. At the center of the redevelopment would rise One World Trade Center, designed to create a new landmark while remaining connected to the history of the place. The skyline was beginning to take a completely new shape. As One World Trade Center rose higher, it became a powerful new presence in the New York skyline. Its design combined modern engineering with elements intended to connect the new building to the history of the site. When construction was finally completed, the tower stood as the centerpiece of a rebuilt World Trade Center. The skyline had changed dramatically, but the location remained deeply connected to the story of the Twin Towers. Today, the original Twin Towers exist only in photographs, films, memories, and historical records. Yet their influence can still be seen across New York. Their engineering changed the way people thought about super-tall buildings, while their history became part of the story of the city itself. The new World Trade Center stands nearby, but the memory of the two towers remains an important part of Lower Manhattan's identity. The story of the Twin Towers is ultimately a story of architecture, people, ambition, loss, and remembrance. From an extraordinary construction project to one of the world's most recognizable skylines, the towers became part of history in a way few buildings ever have. Today, the World Trade Center continues to stand in Lower Manhattan, while the legacy of the original towers lives on through history, memory, and the people who remember them. The Twin Towers are gone, but their story remains part of New York's history. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to the channel for more stories about the world's most remarkable places and events.